Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Wheaton. I'm the Director of Policy and Practice here in Youth Justice New South Wales. This afternoon, I have the pleasure of introducing our next keynote speaker, Mr. Justin Mohamed. Justin is a Gooreng man from Bundaberg in Queensland, who is currently the Victorian Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People. Justin has worked with Victorian Aboriginal communities for 20 years before moving to Canberra to take on national positions as the Chairperson of the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation and Chief Executive Officer of Reconciliation Australia. Prior to his move to Canberra, Justin held positions based in the Shepparton region as the Inaugural Director of the Academy of Sport, Health and Education, and also CEO and later Chairperson of the Rumbalara Aboriginal Cooperative. He chaired the Victorian Aboriginal Community Controlled Health and chaired the Hume Regional Aboriginal Justice Advisory Council. Justin has held positions on multiple community, state and national boards, working groups and committees. He continues to be a Director of Supply Nation, Co-Chair of Cricket Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Committee and Board Member of the Kaiela Institute. Welcome, Justin. We've just lost Justin, so bear with us a moment and we'll bring him back online in just a moment. Hello, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us through that momentary delay. I understand we now have Justin with us, so I'll throw over to Justin.
Thank you, Mike. Apologies, technical difficulties. Moved house just this weekend and into a new place, trying to get Wi-Fi and internet working. So these are some of the joys of COVID, but also moving with technology. But I'd like to firstly just thank you and for this opportunity to speak. Hopefully what I'm going to present today will be something which will be meaningful and provide some insights of the work that we're doing here in Victoria, Australia. Before I do, I wanted to acknowledge the Aboriginal land which I'm meeting on at the moment here in Victoria, just outside of Melbourne, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Also like to acknowledge my brothers and sisters across the Tasman and other First Nations people that are joining in here today, and want to acknowledge your ancestors, your elders that are with us, and for the inspiration they've given all of us to do the work that we do and pursue the endeavour to get equal justice and raise the status as in the sense of reversing the current status of our children and young people in the youth justice system, and providing an opportunity for all to be able to prosper and to live their lives as well as the way they should. So with that said, I'm going to try to be fairly quick to move through because I know we're a little bit behind. But as mentioned, I am the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People here in Victoria. I'm a Gooreng man from in Queensland, near a place called Bundaberg, but I've been living here in Victoria on and off for nearly 23 years. The Commission is an independent statutory body, which most people may understand how commissions work. And with the Children and Young People's Commission here in Victoria, we were one of the very first commissions in Australia to have a commissioner dedicated for Aboriginal children and young people. I'm pleased to say a number of other states and territories in Australia have since followed. The Commission is empowered to conduct systemic inquiries and identify things which it could be with individual young people or could be with departments or processes and policies which take place that we believe can be improved or needs to be looked into because it is causing systemic issues and effects for children and young people who may be accessing them. Today, I want to speak to you about a report which the Commission recently done, which is Our Youth, Our Way. Very much in the, you may see in Aboriginals slogans on T-shirts, which is always was, always will be. And a part of where we wanted to make sure that we want to be committed and have responsibility, that we want to ensure that our youth can enjoy a way of life which is connected to our way of life and not the life which is sometimes put in front of them through systemic structures, government policies, and obviously issues which flow on from that. So what we did, we examined the experiences of Aboriginal children and young people in the youth justice system. And with that said, we really want to ensure that we wanted young people's voices captured in this report. Our inquiry was tabled in the Victorian Parliament, which is part of obviously the mandate and legislation that we have early June this year. And together with the report, we also presented the Parliament with a possum skin cloak, which has a strong significance to the community here in Victoria, but right across Australia, where possum skins traditionally would have been sewn together to provide protection against the elements of the winter and the wind and the rain, but also inside the possum skins would be etched, normally burnt or painted, family lines, stories, traditions and law. And so we replicated this with our conversations that we had with our young people right across the state, that we wanted to ensure that our report had a cultural expression of the report, which we wanted to ensure that the Victorian Parliament and others who read it realise and understand that this wasn't just a report on paper. This is a report which came from hearing many voices from Aboriginal community members, but most importantly, children and young people. We just go to the next slide, thank you. Slide. You'll see in front there is a possum skin. This is one of the possum skins here. I know there might be a little bit of a pest over there in New Zealand, but here in Australia we it's probably going through the slides there, I can just see. But if we go back to the very first one, the possum skin. This is from a group of young people from a place it's called Geelong, which is Motherwurrung country. And on that skin there, the young people we spoke to had either been in justice system, who are currently in there now, or had been in the past. And it was interesting when we spoke to young people, their stories were very much about moving forward, staying connected to culture, to family and on country. And this here with their symbols, and I read exactly what the young people were saying in this story, which is part of our report. It says the gathering circle, which you see the big circle there, shows that many people that are needed to support young people on our journey. In the centre is the young person, as a reminder to keep our needs central when trying to support us. The eagle flying above is Bunjil, which is the Aboriginal word from the Wurundjeri word for eagle, and it's the protector, the creator, who's looking over everyone. Bunjil's law is about taking care of children and doing no harm. So we thought that was quite significant. That's on the front cover, and you'll see as we go through. There's a few other slides with the possum skins from other regions in the background. So if you just move to the next slide, the timeline. Thank you. So over our Youth Our Way, it came directly out of a recommendation in 2016, which the Victorian government said they needed to review the youth justice services. And part of that recommendation, there needed to be a standalone inquiry, a report done on the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children and young people in the youth justice system. But not only was there an inquiry, but a task force where we were to work in partnership with the Department of Justice and Community Safety to unpack and provide some very complex planning with the regions around how to address the overrepresentation, but also to provide the regions with a solution-based but practical support about supporting some of the most complex young people that they have in their regions, which we did across the 13 regions which we visited. So we examined all the children, all Aboriginal children and young people in the youth justice system between a period of time, and that was back in from October 1st of October 2018 to the 31st of March 2019. And by gee, we would never have realised sitting in 2019 how the world was going to be changed. So in a lot of ways, by doing a lot of this work in 2019 was allowed us to get around and spend time in community around campfires, and with many of the young people that we spoke to, we could do that face to face. If we just move to the next slide, the terms of reference was pretty important. The inquiry sought to focus on the systemic drivers of overrepresentation and lived experience of Aboriginal children and young people and their families. It was unlike anything the Commission had done before, and today I want to take you through the reasons for this inquiry, the recommendations that followed it, but the journey we took to ensure it was driven by the Aboriginal children and young peoples themselves, their families and their communities, and is in many ways this report is theirs. Though we have tried in the best way possible to get out to every region since we tabled it, most of that's been online. We've had overwhelming support from the organisations, Aboriginal organisations, communities and young people of what has come out through this report. So we're all very proud of that. The next slide gives you just some basic information here. I mean, the overrepresentation of any First Nations young people, children and young people in the youth justice system, and very much so here in Australia, is often often an old storyline. But unfortunately, that old storyline, there hasn't been too much positive action that can see these numbers reduced. So we aren't sitting here talking about overrepresentation anymore. And very much Victoria, though we are a very progressive state, had this disparity, which we wanted to, well, we built this report onto so we can address it. We can once and for all address it and resolve this so we don't have to hopefully speak on this matter in years to come. As we went through, the report captured children that was entering it, children that have, and young people that have moved away from it, and we wanted to make sure that we captured every step of the way. We can't just explain the overrepresentation wasn't, we really, we realised pretty quickly it wasn't just about youth justice and the system or just about police. We knew there was a number of things that connected or contributed to the overrepresentation of young people, children and young people in the youth justice system. So we had to look at the structures, the policies, the practices that underpinned our social institutions and determine how they operate. So it applied to not, as I mentioned, youth justice system definitely, but also the child protection system, health, housing, education, a broad range of many different departments, ministers, secretaries, and so forth that we had to speak to. And when we went to the regions, many of them were around the table, as many of these young people were either involved in a number of these departments. Obviously, education speaks for itself, but in community housing, in child protection, and obviously, and some of them were also embedded in the health system for their health needs. Aboriginal children and young people were that we found in Victoria. Again, wouldn't be a surprise to many here, but there was a disproportionate amount of targeting by police. The number of young people that were sentenced by courts was far higher than non-Aboriginal children, and the number of young people that were removed from families and communities were also significantly high. We know from the data that collected during the inquiry, we knew that there was more like Aboriginal children and young people were more likely to be arrested and detained, less likely to be cautioned, more likely to be refused bail, more likely to be sentenced for longer periods of community-based supervision, and that year on year, youth justice centres hold Aboriginal children and young people, sentenced or unsentenced, for longer days on average than non-Aboriginal counterparts. When we talk about overrepresentation of Aboriginal children and young people in the youth justice system, what we're talking about isn't what we are talking about is high percentages, but low numbers. The first thing that I kind of realised when I started going through, when I first became placed in this position as commissioner, I visited a youth justice centre, and before I went there, they said there is 70% of the young women that were there were Aboriginal. So I was gobsmacked with that. We make up less than 3% of the population, and there's 70% in the youth justice centre. But when I walked in there, there was actually a total of 12 young women, and I think it was about 8, if I do my math properly, were Aboriginal. So when I started talking to those young women, I asked them what region or who their mob was, who their traditional lands were, family names. I started realising that many of these young women came from different regions. And when I broke that down, I walked away and thought, if that region could just look after one Aboriginal, one of these young women, and they were just given that responsibility, we knew that would make an impact, because over 65% of Aboriginal young people that entered the youth justice centre return. And I thought straight away then, the numbers aren't as big as what the percentages are, and I think this is something we can achieve. So if we go to the next slide, it's around the methodology, and pretty important to do an inquiry like this, and some of the recommendations I'll talk about a bit later on, really was going to shape the current structure of justice. And not only the structure of justice, but what the general public thought, what politicians, what the current government and opposition would think. So we had to make sure that our methodology, how we're going to gather this information, present this report, basically had to be so watertight that no one could pull that apart or say that it just can't happen, or it's not in line with where the community wants to go. So first of all, as mentioned, we did case files on every Aboriginal young person. We visited the communities, 13 communities, but in those communities, we visited many towns and small towns and communities that were linked to the major centres. We unpacked the numbers. We looked at all the different data behind, including their health, education levels, any disability plans that they had. We looked over the data which was available to us, and under our legislation and our mandate, we're able to gather data of these young people, which was very, very helpful. We examined all the literature that there was here in Victoria, but also overseas, what was happening in other parts of Australia, which a lot of reports have been written. We scrutinised the legislation, the policy, the guidelines, and we looked at the past reviews or recommendations that had been picked up, and a very famous Royal Commission, which was done here in Australia, which was the Royal Commission in the Aboriginal Justice and Custody, which just had its 30th anniversary when it was tabled. We unpacked the number of recommendations that just haven't been actioned by the Australian government or by the state government. We then invited public submissions, which we got a number of those from both Aboriginal organisations, but also non-Aboriginal organisations. And we met with Aboriginal organisations, service providers, youth justice staff, basically anyone, school teachers who work with Aboriginal children and young people across Victoria, especially the ones that were in the youth justice system or that had been in the youth justice system. And one of the very, very fun memories back when we were able to travel very freely, myself and the Secretary of the Department of Justice and Community Safety, we flew over to your country, New Zealand, and we saw firsthand how the youth justice system is working, not working. We visited a number of centres over there around, predominantly around the Wellington region, and we picked, as much as we could, information and insights of how things have developed, how things can be further pushed along, to build a broader understanding of, for us to have a report which we could table to the Victorian government. Other countries with similar sort of structures, this is some of the things that can be done. But above that, what we did do, we wanted to ensure we heard the voices of the people this report was going to have the most impact on, and that was the children and young people themselves. And we also wanted to talk to their carers, their grandparents, their aunties, uncles. So we had, the forums on within boardrooms, right through to around kitchen tables, outside around fires, campfires, just really trying to dig as far as we can to find out what we can do. And what we had to do with this is we had to ensure, and this is the question which we raised early in the inquiry, that if we read all the legislation or we looked at all the evidence that's out there, and when I say evidence, the westernised evidence, the things that are in literature, the data that's produced, if we read all that, and then if we go to the community, and this is the question we had, and we speak to the young people, we speak to the elders, if that said something different, what we're going to do with it? Because, governments are like, they want evidence-based. So we turned we got advice externally, and we said, well, what if the community and what if the young people were saying something different to what data and literature and the evidence which people are making policies and changing legislation on? What if there's a different voice that comes from that, our consultations? And we heard, which we were able to do, we made sure we interviewed enough people in the community, enough number of young people, that if that came up, that we were able to then choose what we're going to go with. And as any First Nations person, as an Aboriginal person myself, if the elders and if the young people and community are saying that, that's the line which we're going to take. And this report, I'm glad to say, has taken that. Just the next slide, and I'll probably just skim through this, but the next slide's around our community engagement. It was, as I said, so important for us to make sure this was something which was not going to be just a desktop sort of review, something that was going to be shelved over for the next decade with many of our reports. We wanted this report to be connected to people, And we wanted not only just for the Commission to be able to advocate for, but for all parts of the community to be able to advocate for us. And what we've seen here in Victoria at the moment, that community engagement, when I say community, but I'm talking about not only the Aboriginal community, but the broader community, talking about the different functions of the justice system, the courts, the magistrates or judges that are sitting there. Now we're seeing this report being quoted in courtrooms. We're seeing this report being referred to by politicians, even the opposition, to what's happening. We've seen many in education forums, in family safety, which is our family violence forums, that this report's getting traction to ensure that there has to be a new way of looking at youth justice. And the past, we need to start disassembling some of these structures, but it's going to take more than just Aboriginal people. It's going to take more than just the Department of Justice. It's going to take a whole of government and a whole of community approach. So during the inquiry, we took a place-based approach to engagement. This meant getting out, as I said, to all these young people, and it meant many hours in cars driving from one place to the other. It meant trying to just keep the energy flowing because it was pretty taxing. We really went back to back on this flow. I remember driving from the airport after landing, getting to the next community, and one of my staff that work with me, as we're going to do these private sessions where we unpack young people's their lives and try to build something very strong around it. As at 10 o'clock at night, I was getting the briefing as I was driving a couple of hours to get there over the phone, so we could be at the meeting at 8 o'clock the next morning all ready to go. But in saying that, what it showed, and clearly by going to community and speaking to young people from different regions, nearly in a 24-hour period back to back, it showed it really shone a light on when things are working, how I wouldn't say easy, but how much of an impact that has and can actually change the way a young person's life may go. But unfortunately, in most places, though there was a few glimpses of that really good work happening, in many of the places we saw just how it isn't working and the dramatic impact that has on young people. And often they just stay within that roller coaster life of justice, even right up until, and we spoke to some people that have now moved out of their youth justice age limit and now are into the adult justice. And they all say that they wish they had better supports and better coordination when they were younger. So our next slide, our way. So this report is unique. It is every chapter begins with our way. That's when I say our way, the Aboriginal way. And it describes what the Aboriginal community's vision is for children and young people, and it relates to every aspect of the justice system. Although the Commission does not speak for Aboriginal community throughout the inquiry, we listened to the community's views, experience and aspirations. And we had a responsibility to reflect these in a true and meaningful way. And even if it did be, if it shook the four walls of justice, if it upset people that were in positions that were running programs or was running parts of supports for young people, then so be it. We had to be courageous, we had to be brave, and that's what our community demanded from this report. So what did we hear if we go to the next slide? During our consultations, our children and young people spoke with us openly and with heart and courage. And when I spoke about how we had to be courageous and brave, these young people were so brave and courageous the way they spoke to us. Once we broke through the surface, they told us about their hopes and dreams. They told us about how they want to move on. They don't want to be in the space that they're in. They told us about how they feel unprotected from a system. They feel often scared, and they were yearning to have a place where they could call home, a safe place, people they could rely on, even if it was only one person, and even talked about their struggles with drug addictions, alcohol, and other sort of matters quite openly with us. So once we heard that, we came out of our first couple of consultations and said, we've got to make sure we get this done right for them, but not only for them, but for the young people that are coming through in the next generations. What we heard, if you go to the, still on slide, slide 10, yeah, thank you. What we heard is that, as mentioned, they talk about, when I say they, the children and young people, they all talk about the journey that they're on, and they know and then this in their words, and I'll probably edit a little bit, censor some of the words, but so when we stuff up, and we will stuff up, we just need to be caught and we need to be put back on the right track. But usually that doesn't happen till well down the line. They said they needed support and help, and they wanted to be connected to their culture and their community. And the current justice system here in Victoria usually removes young people from their culture and from their community as the way justice is rolled out and currently. And they also wanted to, as I mentioned, wanted to feel safe. In the next slide, continuing, while there was common themes which merged right across the state, we found that each community had their own experiences to share and their unique needs and their strengths to build on. And what we wanted to do is make sure this report wasn't built on a deficit model, but it was built on a strength-based model. And I'll tell this little story, which I just found it was really so heartening. Every region we went to, we asked each region to identify some of their more complex young people, and then as a commissioner, getting everyone around the table, could be anything from a sport coach to their school teacher, youth justice, the police officer, etc. And sometimes the room would be filled with 23 people who are supposed to be all working for that young person or working around that young person. And we'd sit there and go through. And the very first session that I had, a police officer walked in and I said, well, can we hear a little bit, can we hear the background of this young person? And they started reading, and then the pile of paper was so big, and they started reeling off every offence this young person had. And it was going for about 15 minutes. And it caught me by surprise. And I was, when things catch you by surprise, sometimes, well, anyway, like me, I'm a bit slow to react, but I'm thinking, this is not right. There's something wrong with this. So we pulled it up. I said, let's have a break. We came back and I said, okay, we need to find, I know what their rap sheet is. And that's why they're here. We know they've done things wrong. I don't need to go over every one of those in detail. What I want to know is about what we don't know about this young person. What are they good at? What drives them? What are their strengths? And as soon as I started talking about that, the number of workers, and there's a few community members, it was amazing how the dialogue changed for that young person. And it wasn't a deficit base of how bad it was. It was about all these great attributes that they had. And that's what we built from then on to make sure we built this report on strengths from the community and also from the young people. In the next slide. Look, this is the negative experiences within the service system. Most of this is here, but I'll touch on a couple of things. So most of our young people we consult on this journey, the very first time they came in contact police was well under the age of 14. It was probably a 10, 11, 12-year-old. That's when they were pulled up for offending of some sorts. But many of them, they actually talked about their first contact with a police officer way before then. It was when they were first removed from their mum or dad, the blue uniform, the police car, and they may have been 3 or 4 years of age or even younger. There was part of what we found here was that the youth justice system that we have here in Victoria, that it had this revolving door, that it didn't divert people away from the youth justice system, but once young people entered it, they found it very hard to break out of it, in the sense of not physically breaking out of it, but to be stronger and feel more resilience to be able to go in and not return. And many felt that once they entered into the system, they felt the system itself, the justice system, and many around, including education, they felt harassed and targeted, and then the circle was never broken. Some mentioned that just because of their surnames, of who their parents were, or maybe who their older brother was, that they were also targeted by law enforcement, which made it very difficult for them to break out of those shadows. The next slide, if we go to the well-being, many of the children we talked about their challenges with substance dependency, and even as young as 12 and 13, he said they were addicted to a particular drug or alcohol, and they made sure that they had to they were struggling with mental health issues. Some of them was physical disabilities as well, and they found it very hard to manoeuvre through a system. And I found it very difficult during this piece to hear when a 13-year-old says that they've got an addiction to a drug and they want help, but they can't get help. I thought, well, gee, as a commissioner, I want to make this happen. But I found when I went out, there's very few places that will take a child under the age of 16 of a drug dependency issue. If young people were involved in sexual offences, they were branded and targeted, and there's very few places for them to go to live even, because there's so much, there isn't the services around. But one of the main things that I found through all this well-being, culture, Aboriginal culture always seemed to be, in many cases, was the add-on at the very last part of a young person's time of 16, 17. And we find when these young people, even if you include child protection, could be in a government system in some parts from birth, that many of their cultural connection was left undone, wasn't attended to, and definitely wasn't given the time or resources for that to happen. And then trying to play catch up when they're 16 and 17 was very difficult. And that's also for their mental health and other trauma which they have seen and had maybe experienced when they were younger, was never fully addressed throughout all this time that they've had in and out of the justice system, and which further just their entrenchment in the justice system seemed to be the only passage of life that they could see. The next slide, I think we're going, So I'll just skip through the strength and resilience and connection to culture. This is something which I spoke about earlier, but what we witnessed is their hope and positivity. And for some of the young people, what they've gone through in their life, I just was blown away by their resilience, their how strong they were, and they weren't looking for excuses, but they wanted to move forward in a more powerful and protective way around with their Aboriginal family members back on country, and learning more about who they are, and they are wanting to be these the next elders, the next role models for their community. So what we came across with is that the regional forums we held in every region, the children and young people who spoke to us emphasised that, again, culture had to be central, it had to be in the foundation, and their sense of self and ability to heal was only going to ever happen when culture was in the centre of that, and not something that came on later on. However, what we have found is that the justice system often fails to facilitate this support, this type of support meaningfully. And I think there needs to be not a lot, our report talks about how the system itself needs to get a better understanding. It needs to reflect on its biases and the structures which have been established, how they've damaged and they've hurt Aboriginal communities and families and young people, and how they have been established not in the best interest of young people, but more so in a place of discipline or punishment, I should say, rather than building a stronger and a more resilient young person and having them healed and be able to move forward. So the next slide, thank you. Key themes, 10 key themes, they all kind of had a chapter for themselves, 41 findings, 75 recommendations. And As you can see there, the key themes, the last three, 8, 9 and 10, is pretty much focused on the justice system. The 7 before that is a whole lot about life, a whole lot about how do you have a self-determined youth justice system, a reimagined youth justice system, not the current one we're trying to fit and walk in between the structure that's there. But if that was dismantled, what would it look like? Adjust an aged appropriate system. When you notice we didn't just say justice appropriate age, but so we're looking at where an age appropriate system is. So if a young person's 11, how they get treated compared to someone who's 17. Under the current system, get treated exactly the same, very much so. Or when they come in contact. Child-centered system, is our system a child-centered system, or is it an adult system just transferred into the label above it, which is youth justice? And unfortunately, if you walk into any of our youth justice centres, as the young people who transfer into adults, so in the adult system, they have more freedom than what they've got in the youth justice systems, because the security is just as high, if not higher, and way smaller facilities. Family, community and culture, you wouldn't be surprised with what I've just talked about. It gets a chapter. A safe and caring home, you'd be surprised how many young people, and sadly, some young people said they feel the safest when they're in a youth justice centre. They can go to sleep. And if that's what their life is, we said we've got to really change that so they can feel safe and they can feel cared for in their own home. Wellbeing, education and learning. Education and learning was a very interesting one. Many young people strive that they want to get good education, but if they're in and out of justice, education doesn't quite flow with that, with their journey of life for that period of time, and many of them fall away from that. So those 10 themes really pushed us to ensure that this wasn't just about justice. There was a whole range of areas that need to be looked at if we wanted to see change. And the next slide, thank you. So the changes we want to see, if we go to the next one, I think, next slide. Changes we want to see is, and I mentioned about the reimagined youth justice system. And when I say reimagined, when I speak to the Aboriginal community and the elders, we've also, as First Nations people, as we've got to reimagine, not kind of try to, we're all kind of influenced from what we know. But if we dismantled something and said, can you rebuild it, what would it look like? I think a lot of the times we've spent, and I'll point the finger straight at myself because I've been part of this journey for 30 years, is sometimes we try to redesign or refurbish the existing structures. And I've got to a point now, I'm a little bit older. My birthday was yesterday, so another year older. But I've got to a point now that I think we've got to start looking at dismantling the structures that are there, because doesn't matter how much extra work we put in to try to refurbish, redesign, change the outside appearance, the structure will be the thing which will prevent any of our children and young people from living the life that they should be able to live. We want to see that this is a child-centred, self-determined, Aboriginal self-determined. It's just and has a age-appropriate legal system. Some of the recommendations we made was that empowering Aboriginal communities to control parts of the youth justice system, not to be included at the end, not to say, well, yeah, once they get into a youth justice centre, we might get an Aboriginal elder or Aboriginal community to come in and run programs. That's way too late. We need to, as soon as there is a sense that this young person needs support in their community, that the community are empowered, they are legislated to be able to take controls of the youth justice system and do it in ways that is around healing, building stronger culture, and addressing the issues at hand. When we were in one of the regions we went to, there was a number of Aboriginal senior women which we met with. And one of them stood up and said, we're talking about what needs to happen and how do we go about reducing these numbers. And this particular region had a lot of young people in the youth justice system. And one of the elders stood up and said, I don't know why we're wasting this time talking about what we need to do. We know where they live. there's about 6 homes, 6 houses in this community. Each one of them, we all know all the issues that are happening. Why can't we just go there and start talking and working with those families? And for too much of it, and that really hit home with the report, saying too often we are waiting for the young person to offend. We're waiting for them to fall over, and then we'll come in. And the elders are saying, we know that there is a number of young people, and there's only one mum looking after 5 or 6 children. They need such support. They need help. Why can't we move in there now? Because we know what the potential, the road which will take place if nothing comes in earlier, and the system itself often waits till it's too late before it moves in. The other one we're looking at is that, obviously we want a better resource, community-led prevention, early intervention, justice reinvestment programs. I mean, some of the communities are ready for this. They want to do this. They want to take control of a system or of a part of a system which has been a lot of the times taken out of the control of the community. Obviously, like New Zealand and many other countries around the world, but particularly at the moment in Australia here, unfortunately, hearing the most recent, announcement, but we've got a recommendation to increase the criminal responsibility to 14 and the age of a young person in custody to 16. Unfortunately, we just heard, well, it's unfortunate or fortunate, but I don't think halfway measures are any good. We've heard that the government is considering raising the age to 12. Now, some people may welcome that, but I feel our young people, our most vulnerable young people, are always given only half measure. And I believe that step is only a half measured step if we really want to at least get to the baseline of what the UN is saying. The next slide, thank you. So that's a little bit about the age appropriate system. I won't talk too much. It's kind of there, about 10 to 13, 14 to 15, and 16 plus. If we go to the next slide, the community-driven focus areas. We want Aboriginal organisations, the community-controlled organisations, as we call it here in Australia. We want them to be central to the reimagining of the justice, youth justice for our children and young people. We want them to be empowered, resourced, and having the be able to run the programs, have the capacity to have longevity and reliability, as we know that many programs in communities sometimes only have a short lifespan, maybe sometimes up to whatever the government cycle is, 12-month funding, 2-year funding, but we're saying they need to be long-term. As young people, their lives are more than just 12 months or 2 years. We want to see the difference, achieving these differences, I should say, of Aboriginal organisations determine defined programs. Rather than government saying this is a program you need to apply for it, we're saying that the community organisations need to be able to design that and determine where that works. That might be different programs and different designs for different regions. One of the biggest things that we have as an issue with that a program is developed and we expect all regions to take on the same program. Many regions, like the different tribal groups, the different traditional owners, have different customs, very similar, but there are differences. Difference to environment, difference to opportunities. So that's a part of what we're working with. The report makes many recommendations about related to self-determination, and in Victoria, the Victorian government has committed to Aboriginal self-determination. We've got a treaty process that's happening at the moment, and also we've got a commission the commission is called Uruk and Justice, which is Truth and Justice Commission, which is taking place. So with those in hand, we're saying, well, we need to ensure that we have self-determination, not just at the end point in a treaty or a rule or a commission, but right from the start of a young person's life, the self-determination can be there, and the communities that are raising those children are resourced and empowered to do so. The next slide is the key recommendations related to Aboriginal organisations, and I talked about the transferring the legal jurisdiction to Aboriginal community control organisations, establishing community-controlled crisis accommodation in every region, because we want to keep young people on country. Resourcing Aboriginal organisations to develop and implement high-quality cultural support plans. In Australia, we have cultural support plans for many children that are in out-of-home care or child protection. We're saying that the cultural support plan should move with the young person and that the organisations in the regions are given the ability to do that at a very high level. Establishing Aboriginal community-controlled youth foyers across the state. There's a number of other ones there, but the last one I will just talk about before we get to the final slide is that to ensure that Aboriginal children and young people have access to culturally safe youth offending programs while they're in custody, and they are delivered by Aboriginal people organisations. We're very through this process. We do not believe that when a young person goes into custody, their culture is something they should be disconnected from. Now, we've made it very strong, and when people question that, because we've seen in some places that culture is used as a carrot, as a reward, and totally disagree. Culture isn't a reward. Shouldn't be used as a reward, I should say. It shouldn't be used as a carrot for young people to, if you behave, then you can do these cultural, activities. It should be part of their rehabilitation, their strengthening, and their building a stronger individual so they can move forward. Culture itself shouldn't be disconnected when they're if they do find themselves in a youth justice centre. It should be very much the opposite. It should be central for them to be able to be resilient enough that they don't return back in. And that's where we're moving at the moment. I'm pleased to say the Department of Justice and Community Services around youth justice are really going a long way in trying to ensure that this is not an add-on. It's not used to punish a child if they've misbehaved by cutting them from their culture, but they are given this right as they have to education. That it's even more important that this is not something which is disrupted throughout their journey. Our last slide, and I'll come to the end now. The final slide is Our Youth, Our Way was more than 3 years in the making. But the issues it deals with go back and has a really deep past. 31 years ago, I started as a youth justice worker, going into homes representing young people who are going to court, trying to get a broader picture of their background, of their home situation. And some of the things I heard 31 years ago, unfortunately, when I went around the state doing this report, I had similar issues still there, 30 years on. And I just couldn't believe my ears when I heard them, and it saddened me. It doesn't just tell the story of a youth justice system today. It speaks about a whole range of issues, not only just for the young person, their life, but their parents' life, their grandparents' life. Excuse me. It examines the failures of the system that were never designed to meet the needs of Aboriginal children and young people, and it makes direct and targeted recommendations to improve these. We've got to understand that systems like justice, systems like child protection, here in Australia anyway, and I'm sure it's not too much different in other parts of the world, First Nations people, child protection was never created to protect the children. It was created in a path, and this is where when we have to disassemble the structures, it was created to remove children from Aboriginal parenting, to assimilate, to breed out culture, to stop people speaking language. Education wasn't there to build the value of Aboriginal culture. It was about, you must stop speaking your language and you got to learn English. You can't practice cultural ceremony, or that doesn't happen. We'll teach you a westernized system. And the same with justice. Justice wasn't there to protect our people. It was there to protect the non-Aboriginal people who came to this land. And so when I talk about this, there is deep-rooted connections to why we're still fighting and battling with overrepresentation for our children and young people in justice and in many other areas. So Our Youth, Our Way is a powerful statement of self-determination for Aboriginal people. It reflects the hope, dedication and promise of Aboriginal community-led programs that are already creating positive changes around the state, and we want to see more. And most importantly, it gives a voice to the ones which this will affect the most, and that's our children and young people, and to their families and their communities. And in doing this, it hopes for a better way of doing justice, a way that aligns with Aboriginal ways, as Aboriginal community says, our youth, our way. And finally, when I first started, I was given a stone from an elder. He just pulled it out of his pocket. He said, I've had this, I'm carrying it around. And he's noted to give these stones to different people. He said, I want to take this stone. He called me a young man, so that was pretty good. Look, take this stone, young man. The work that you're going to do is going to be very important. And as we know, and he said, you know, the story of the stone, the ripple effect in the water, though you're working with these young people, the ones that you're looking at and sitting around conferences and speaking to them today, that the work that you're going to be doing is not going to just be for this generation, but it will ripple and touch many generations along the way. And just as I was about to walk away and said, thank you, he says, don't mess it up. So that's what's sitting with me through every one of those sessions. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed the presentation today.
Thank you, Justin, for that very powerful and thought-provoking presentation. We have run out of time for question and answer, but Justin, there is a few questions in the live chat if you have a chance to jump on and answer those. But otherwise, I'd just like to pass on again a massive thank you for your time this afternoon. And for all of our conference participants, we'll now head off into our concurrent sessions for this afternoon. Thanks again, Justin.
Thank you.